My name is Simon Reid-Henry. I am an historical and political geographer, a civil society advocate, and a writer. Welcome to my exp. So the title Empire of Democracy comes from a quote of the French liberal Alexis de Tocqueville, writing back in the 1830s about what he had seen in America. And he used the phrase, the empire of democracy. And by the empire of democracy, he meant the ways in which the conditions, the general conditions of equality that he saw in America was something fundamental to what American democracy was. And he was writing this for a French audience, and he was in many ways trying to educate and to convince his French audience that there was something in the American model of democracy that France might wish to aspire to. Now, there's a certain play on words here as well, because Tocqueville, like many liberals, was also an imperialist. And so the word empire of democracy has, in a sense, a double meaning. So one of the other things that Tocqueville mentions in that quote on the empire of democracy is what he refers to as the ideas and institutions of society. And really, for me, that's at the core of what democracy is. The ideas that democracy, modern democracy, our democracy codes for is, on the one hand, liberalism and freedom, and on the other hand, equality. And these are not always two values that go so very well together. My freedom is not necessarily the same as your freedom, and my capacity to enjoy my freedom may often come at the expense of your freedom. Freedom and equality can in some ways work against each other. And managing that tension has been at the heart of the democratic enterprise really for all of the last 200 years. But the ways in which it was solved as a problem in the post-war era, post-1945, which was, just to give a few examples, one very much based on a model of political citizenship and duty and conformity. It was based on a model of economic growth and a welfare state that enabled people to live up to their own aspirations without worrying about treading on the aspirations of others, without worrying about the influx of others from other parts of the world, without worrying about a growth in inequality. Quite the opposite. Economic growth led to greater equality for much of that period. In other words, the ideal conditions for this problem of equality and freedom to be solved. But after the 1970s, where many of those assumptions and also many of the institutions that enabled those assumptions to take place began to fall apart, all at the same time, suddenly the answer to that question changed. And my argument in that book, and more broadly, is that it's this change that gives us the form of democracy we have today. And so it makes sense to not take democracy for granted, to not assume that democracy will always muddle through. It depends entirely on the quality of the answers we give that. It depends on the quality of the leadership, and it depends on the capacity of individuals through the institutions that they are given to live up to the challenge of reconciling in productive ways, in positive ways, freedom with equality. So 1989 is one of those years in the Western historical canon that has a strong political morality attached to it. And by that I mean there's a narrative about what 1989 meant that supersedes the reality of what 1989 was. 1989 is usually interpreted as the great gift of democracy from the West to the East. Eastern European countries who had been living under authoritarian rule suddenly were free, able to become democracies, to engage and to merge with the Western economic world order. And their citizens were granted rights and freedoms that they had for many years only wished they could have had. And of course, there's a huge amount of truth to this, and there's a huge amount of benefit for all of those citizens attached to those changes. But the narrative that somehow democracy is or was or can be something that is given to a country, this whole notion of democracy promotion, is fundamentally flawed. It's flawed because democracy emerges in and through what societies themselves determine. And it's flawed because what was actually given to the East in the years after 1989 was much less obviously democracy than it was free markets and capitalism, particularly in a country like Russia. What was given was, in a sense, something that was taken. Markets were opened up, companies, investments moved in, and the capacity of those societies to respond to those changes, almost overnight, perhaps not surprisingly, overwhelmed many of them in the interim period. One of the other things that the narrative of 1989 obscures is the question that, in a way, Western liberal democratic societies have begun to pose themselves already in the 1980s, which is whether freedom and free markets necessarily create better, more coherent, cohesive, and happier societies. And by banishing that question, at least for a decade or so, the 1990s in particular, a period when it seemed that all of the problems of the past had been resolved, the world was opening up, societies were coming together, and in many ways Tocqueville's vision had been realized. In fact, what we saw come the financial crisis and the beginnings of the realization that the market growth upon which those particular benefits and privileges of Western society had been based came crashing down. It perhaps should have been less of a surprise to us that there was an upwelling of response around the world, both in terms of civil society movements, sit-ins, protests, all of which was in many ways a reaction to the fact that the causes of the political challenges and the economic challenges of the time were much more deeply rooted than perhaps we had expected. So, as geographers, we are always inherently interested and perhaps naturally inclined to be skeptical towards geographical simplifications, metaphors that tell us that, for example, geography is destiny, or claims that geographical designations somehow translate into political or cultural designations. So very often when people speak of the West, they're speaking of a very particular idea about a set of countries, a set of norms, a set of institutions, and also, though they may not realize it, a set of privileges that in actual fact do not constitute any geographical claim to coherence. Do we mean Western Europe? Do we mean North America? Do we mean Japan? Do we mean the antipodes? In different ways, different countries might consider themselves to be part of the West or its Western, or the Western inheritance, intellectually, politically. But in all of those cases, what the West is no more than what people imagine and want it to be. And so very often, as geographers, we would say that the West is an imaginative construct. And like all imaginative constructs, it's used to particular effects. Those that are willing and able to use the West as a claim will do so. And those that understand it as an imposition will also use the West in that way. And so, like any political concepts, the West, the idea of the West, is fundamentally contested. And we need to recognize this whenever we are engaging in conversations about what particular countries or regions or territories mean to us and mean in terms of the history of the world. If there was one misconception about democracy that I would challenge, I think it's the idea that democracy, perhaps even more specifically liberal democracy, is something that is always able to muddle through. That we have democracy, that we have somehow earned it, that we have the capacity to use it, its freedoms, to ensure that we respond to the challenges of the day. And I certainly hope that may be the case, but I would not want to rely on the fact that that is the case. Democracy is ultimately no more and no less than what we make it to be. The institutions we create to nurture and protect it, and the capacity of individuals to live up to the demands of those institutions and of the rules and regulatory framework that we establish around democracy. And that, for me, is where the core of democracy emerges from. And that, for me, needs to be understood as something fundamentally fragile, as something that needs protecting, and as something that will change from era to era. But the idea that democracy itself necessarily and always will continue and survive and thrive, I think is an assumption that we, in the current age in particular, would do well to rid ourselves of.